This week, our Prime Minister joined the leaders of New Zealand and Canada in calling for a ceasefire in Gaza, expressing alarm at the diminishing safe space for civilians in Gaza. Australia's position on this war is now utter nonsense. You cannot, as the Prime Minister's shared statement does, on the one hand, recognise that Hamas must return the hostages and be removed from power, and on the other hand, call for a ceasefire, which would mean Hamas remains in power and repeats October 7th as quickly as possible and as many times as possible, which is exactly what they have threatened to do. Then at the United Nations, our Australian representative voted in favour of the aforementioned UN ceasefire resolution that didn't even mention Hamas by name, much less condemn it in any way, shape or form. That resolution passed despite Israel and America voting against it. The UK cowardly abstained. This is a complete betrayal of Israel by those in the West, who for weeks have, as our Prime Minister has, turned a blind eye to rampant anti-Semitism, which history attests has destroyed humanity and civilizations before. In the meantime, Hamas continues to spill the blood of the very Palestinian people they claim to fight for, while continuing to slaughter innocent Israelis, including those they took hostage. I've said it 1,000 times before, I'll say it 1,000 times more. Every single drop of Gazan blood spilled in this conflict is on Hamas's hands. These people are animals. And yet in the United Nations' eyes and in the eyes of our Western leaders, it seems, it is Israel who needs to cool it with the war crimes. Joining me now is a staunch Israel ally, the author of best-selling books such as The War on the West, The Strange Death of Europe, and Islamophilia, a very metropolitan malady. Douglas Murray. Douglas, thanks so much for being with us this evening.
Great to be with you.
Cheers. What do you make of these domino prime ministers falling straight into Hamas's basically only media strategy, which is use the suffering of those that we are creating, use it to win the hearts and minds of the West by merely pointing the finger straight at Israel, even though we're the very cause for it?
Yeah, I think it's you put your finger on it. That's exactly what Hamas do. Hamas targeted innocent civilians in Israel on October the 7th. And it's a pretty unique terror organization, Hamas, or an unusual one, because yes, it then wishes to use any innocent civilians in Gaza as collateral to their, or indeed the main attack point for their war. I mean, no other... I can't think of an army that has behaved like this in history, which is one of the reasons why Hamas is not an army. It's a terror group. It literally puts civilians in front of its own terrorists. It literally puts civilian buildings above its own terrorist infrastructure, its weapons storage units, its missile storage, and indeed its leaders. This is a sort of cowardly way in which Hamas acts. But as for the Australian government, I think it's been a lamentable episode. Immediately after October 7th, the Australian government said that they would stand staunchly beside Israel and for civilised values. We then see the first vote at the UN, and the Australian government quite rightly doesn't vote for this ceasefire because it doesn't condemn Hamas. And then exactly the same motion comes back a little while later at the UN, and the Australian government goes with it. It shows a terrible lack of leadership. But I would add one other thing. It shows that the current Australian government is very easily swayed. It shows that you just have to have, in this case, like one Muslim minister who breaks ranks and should have been fired for breaking ranks and not having collective responsibility, but breaks ranks and is then not fired, and instead the government adapts to his point of view. You have that, and then you have the fact that, some thousands of Australian Hamas supporters and weirdo leftist activists turn out on the streets of Australian cities, like in other Western cities. The fact that these people turn out seems to have done a great deal to persuade the Australian government. Well, I would have a warning for them, which is watch out, because other people will get in on that trick. When people scent the blood in the water, scent that you're this easily swayed and influenced, my goodness, other people are going to be coming at you as well.
I don't think there's many Australians who would disagree that we have an incredibly weak government. And I've said from the very beginning, this Prime Minister has always been pro-Palestinian. You can watch videos of him with very youthful looks, talking very passionately for the pro-Palestinian cause. On to other news now. I've got to get your thoughts on the US House of Reps has, of course, voted on Wednesday to launch an impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden to examine whether he improperly benefited from his son's Hunter's foreign business dealings. I mean, Reuters says they've done this even though they have yet to find evidence of wrongdoing. That seems to be straight out of the Dems playbook. But is this Christmas come early or what, Douglas? Obviously, we've got the bank reports, we've got Devon Archer, Hunter's former business partner's testimony. We know that there's no evidence. Are you hopeful this inquiry will at last reveal the extent of that family's corruption?
Well, I'm hopeful that it could try to get a bit closer to the truth. Hunter Biden gave a press conference this week in which he said, you know, I'm here. People say, where's Hunter? Well, I'm here. And you think, yeah, like 6 years after everyone was asking. 5 years, 3 years. I mean, it's a really remarkable thing to sort of present himself as having been always open for questioning and always keen to answer any press queries or indeed legal queries. He's done exactly the opposite. And he did he did a very interesting move, which was that perhaps the inevitable one, doubtless, PR'd to death beforehand. But he appealed to the sort of sympathies of the public. He kept referring to the fact that his life had been in disarray, that he referred to his brother, he referred to his father, he talked about, his addiction problems and all that, and indeed, that his life had been in disarray because of his addiction problems around the time some of the allegations happened. Now, this is a very interesting thing, of course, because he does play to, in America, you've always got a kind of 50-50 political divide. There will be some people who will look at that and will say, poor Hunter, everyone's sympathetic to people with addictions and people who've wrecked their lives in some way, which he certainly has, albeit in a very privileged way. There will be some people who look at that and actually feel sorry for him and think, yeah, kind of lay off. I mean, it's true that, as he said, it's embarrassing for him. Naked photos of himself have gone all around the world. They've been held up in the house. But just calling for pity or sympathy doesn't seem to me to be really enough, because Hunter Biden still has serious questions to answer about his business dealings. He talked about how proud he was to have been on the board of several companies. But he didn't say why he was on the board of those companies or what he brought to them or what his work was or indeed what the family cut was. We know from some of the leaked emails that were on the laptop that there were kickbacks within the family. So he can have our sympathy, but only after he's been frank and full and honest about what actually went on. And I think a lot of people realize he just hasn't been. The family haven't been. Everyone else can see the influence peddling operation that seems to have been going on, which is, I have to say, endemic within American politics. But I think that he can only get the kind of sympathy he wants if he's also frank, and that seems to be a million miles away at the moment.
He seems to be taking his best stab at it, though, doesn't he? Like, look at me being authentic. I'm here. I'm ready to talk. God help us. Sorry.
And then he didn't, of course.
Yes, and then he didn't
answer questions, then didn't.
Of course. I can't wait for this inquiry. As we know, it'll have far greater reaching powers to demand what people need to see, hence the point of an impeachment inquiry. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time this evening.